Hello and welcome to our webinar on the importance of managing allergens and gluten-free diets in a hospital catering setting. My name's Chris Cooper and I'm the sales manager for Appetito Healthcare and the National Accounts team. Today I am with our group technical manager from Appetito, founder of Food Allergy Aware and the head of food regulation and networks at Coeliac UK. If you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Hi, so I'm Alex. I'm the head of food regulations here at UK. I'm a dietitian by training and I have been working in the food policy area for the past 20 years in UK, Europe and an international level.
My name is Caroline Benjamin. I set up Food Allergy Aware around 2013 for my frustration of not being able to dine out. My trade is I was a chef, so I've got lots of experience. I was thinking about setting up food, producing food, and then I realised actually training consultancy is what was needed in the industry. And we've got a reputation for doing that within healthcare, pubs, restaurants, cruises. So yeah, that's what we do.
Right. And Ian Mortimer, I've been a food safety specialist really for over 40 years now. I've been over 16 years with Appetito, so I head up the food safety team here and sit in a number of committees around the industry, many with a focus on allergens and including with people like the FSA.
Thank you all. So, understanding food allergens and celiac disease in the healthcare. Alex, prevalence of food allergies and celiac disease in the UK, what does the landscape look like?
For what is celiac disease, so we know that it's estimated that 1 in 100 people have celiac disease. However, only 36% of the people with the condition are clinically diagnosed. So underdiagnosed is a serious problem, and we estimate that about 500,000 people in the UK have not been diagnosed.
So going into allergens, so about 6% of UK adults suffer from an allergy, and about 3 to 5% of children have allergies, and maybe a little bit higher. And 50% of those children have multiple allergies. And there's no correlation with allergens. So a parent may be allergic to milk, but the child might be allergic to nuts. So again, there's no correlation as such as to the allergens and how they follow through. Children can grow out of allergens. So egg and milk allergies tend to grow out. They do a milk ladder. But nuts don't tend to grow out of them, although obviously there's research going on at the moment where they're doing the small, introducing nuts into the diet for children with nut allergies. But again, it has to be done through a medical process.
And I think that's a really interesting point on the medical process, because to actually detect an allergy or a food hypersensitivity, often somebody has to actually be suffering so that the medical team can actually pick up the allergy. Now, if you're, say, celiac, which can have you sitting in the toilet within minutes of eating gluten, or even if you're intolerant, you may have to live with that for 2 weeks, deliberately eating gluten to then be diagnosed. So there's an awful lot of allergies actually aren't diagnosed. And it's quite interesting that, I will refer to my notes because I don't know this one off the top of my head, but I did a little bit of work, and the FSA basically contracted Imperial College London in 2024 to do some research over the incidence. Now, they were looking at hypersensitivity. Now, unfortunately, it went over a period when COVID was high. So also the NHS is under pressure. So they think they only got about 5% at best of those that actually had a reaction and presented. But that was 14 reports per month of somebody presenting with a food allergy. Now, if you think that's just 5% potentially of the real incidence, there's a really high number every month that are being affected. And they came out with a view that perhaps something like 4% of preschool children, 1.2% of school children, and 0.9% of adults present with a diagnosed food allergy. But coming back to what I said before, many of them will be undiagnosed simply because it's such an uncomfortable experience to actually become diagnosed.
Well, one striking fact about celiac disease is it takes on average about 13 years for an adult to be diagnosed. So this is because of the difference in symptoms that you can have and how it can be often mistaken for other condition. So if you take for an average, 13 years is quite striking.
And to be fair, I had that personal experience. I'm not diagnosed celiac. I am still gluten intolerant. But again, it took me a good 10 years and literally you've got IBS. But I think the good thing now with medical diagnosis, if you go to your GP, that if you present symptoms, they have to test you for celiac disease or Crohn's disease as a nice guideline. They can't say, oh, you've got IBS, go deal with it. So that's there as well. But I think the other thing as well with celiac disease, obviously you've got people that are non-symptomatic. So you've got those with hidden celiac disease, or they have the skin format. And again, recognising that some of those symptoms are not always as clear as we'd like to think. But yeah, it's a very grey area, isn't it? There's a lot of research within allergies. I know obviously Natasha's research, they do a lot of work as well. But yeah, we need more research into it, really.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point as well, because as we were discussing before we sat down today, people, I think, believe there is a lot of science, a lot of understanding now around food allergy, when actually it's really in its infancy. There's still an awful lot we need to learn, as we move forward and how these things come about. We don't really even understand why some people get an allergy and some don't, let alone how to deal with that.
Yeah. Could you provide like an overview of the most common food allergies, say like main 14, most common source of gluten, just for people who are not fully aware?
Definitely. So the 14 main allergens, obviously the most common ones to the UK. So we've got the cereals containing gluten. So that's your wheat, your rye, your barley and your oats. We've got eggs, we've got fish, we've got milk, peanuts and tree nuts, soybeans. So they're sort of common to the UK. And then if you introduce things like mustard, so they're very common in Europe. Sesame, which is obviously common for Asian people as well, and soya as well. We talked about allergens that are out there. Soya is in about 60 to 70% of processed food, so it's one of those things that we're not always aware that we're eating it, and it's in those foods. So somebody with a soya allergy can be quite complex. And then milk. I mean, milk obviously is probably the most common one that causes anaphylaxis. Everyone seems to think it's peanuts and nuts, but there's probably 1% of the population higher that suffers from a milk allergy than they do from gluten and dairy, gluten and wheat and those products as well. And if you take in the Asian population, again, a large proportion of Asian population cannot tolerate a dairy product or milk product. So, it depends on where you are, where you're born, and, where you're based as to where the allergens are most common.
Okay, and what would you say, Alex, maybe the differences between allergies, intolerances, celiac disease, and dietary preferences? Is there enough understanding and knowledge on this? And
Well, it's very important, and especially when it comes, I'll start with celiac disease because it's not an allergy, it's not an intolerance, and it's not a lifestyle choice. It's a serious autoimmune condition, so it doesn't sit in any of those. And when someone with celiac disease, this is triggered by gluten, which is a protein that you can find in wheat, barley, rye, and some people with the condition also react to oats. So when this is very important because the moment you need even just a tiny amount of gluten to create a reaction in immune, or your system reacts and it creates a damage to your gut. So this is very important. You've got the allergy, which are IgE mediated, so it's your immune system reacts to that. Again, you have intolerance is different. You don't have the immune system is not involved. By all means, you can still feel unwell, bloated, pain, discomfort, but your body does not get a damage as it would have for an allergy or for celiac when you have a celiac disease. So, finally, you have the lifestyle choices, or when you decide, then that you have decided yourself without being medically diagnosed to eliminate either a nutrient or a food from your diet. You can, but you don't have to. I think that's the biggest difference. Just on this point, probably for the intolerance, speaking about gluten, there are no approved tests yet to determine a gluten intolerance or gluten sensitivity. And you have to do that through elimination. So you have to start by ruling out celiac disease and wheat allergy. because you have to be continuing eating gluten in order to assess that. And after that, then you go by eliminating some of the food in order to see if you respond to the diet.
And I think just terminology-wise as well, people may not realise when they hear hypersensitivity that that's not something different. Hypersensitivity is just a term that came into being really about 18 months ago. I think people started using it to basically cover all of those. So whether it's I nearly said hypersensitivity then, whether it's an allergy or an intolerance, they're grouped together under hypersensitivity, because in reality you have to deal with it in the same way, i.e. you don't want somebody eating the allergen that they need to avoid.
And I think also important, like you were saying, we always say that celiac disease is not an intolerance, it is an autoimmune disease. And the Food Standard Agency have produced or reproduced a poster and now put celiac disease as separate. We always, all the way through our allergy policies, 3 different categories. We never group celiac disease into intolerances. And I think that's really quite key and important, and making sure that people understand that. And I think, the other thing to think about is why are these increasing? Why are we getting more of this? I think with celiac disease, it's becoming more diagnosed and there's a lot more awareness, which is really important. But I think, allergies, why do we get allergies? So diets, we've changed our diets over the years. We're eating foods today that we've never eaten over the years. I think also hereditary, it comes through from family. So again, understanding what your family do. And then, are we too clean? It's that hygiene hypothesis. They've been talking about that. But recently I spoke to Allergy UK and they were also talking about the gut microbiome. So there's an upset in the gut, then that can trigger it. So for example, my son, he's now 26 and he's gluten and dairy free. We went on holiday and he got food poisoning with a chicken nugget that wasn't cooked. Literally, he was really violently ill. After that, his whole gut was upset, and it took us quite a while to figure out what it was. And obviously we tested for celiac disease, but obviously something has gone wrong in his gut, and again now he is still in that situation. So there's those sort of things that are there. How do we increase awareness of understanding of why these are happening?
And you mentioned before about the standards and regulatory standards, and can you provide an overview of that, the standards within the hospitals for us, so what they must follow?
Yeah, I mean, we've got the Food Information for Consumers Act, which obviously everyone has to follow, and that sets out the 14 allergens. It talks about the labelling. To be fair, I was talking about doing some regulatory training. A lot of the prosecutions that go under the Food Safety Act. They don't go under this food information because it's more about the labelling. So there's 2 different areas there: food that's unsafe or not food as described. So a lot of the prosecutions, but it doesn't really happen that much within hospitals. They more often than not give the guidance. But I think the food information is more about the labelling, understanding what they need to do and how they need to put some processes in place. But the standards are also set within a food safety management system. Then we have Natasha's Law, so that came in 2021. Again, it's pre-packed for direct sale foods, so foods that are made on the premises. So it has to be labelled in a very similar way to the food that is pre-packed. They don't necessarily have to put nutritional information on there, but they do need to put the ingredients. It needs to be in the right order, and it needs to be in bold. Obviously, if there's any allergens on there, they shouldn't have contain statements. They can have a may contain statement, so that's quite important. And then recently we've just had the guidance from the Food Standard Agency, which came out, which relates into Owen's Law. But again, that's not regulatory, it's best practice. But there's a lot of us out there who wants to push it a bit further and say, yeah, we'd like to see it being regulatory. I think that's quite key.
And I think adding to that, people may not realise that precautionary allergen labelling, typically people think of as may contain. There isn't any specific law about the use of that, it's still voluntary. However, you can still potentially be prosecuted and fall foul of law because it does come under the general principles and requirements of food law. And that essentially says that you have to risk assess anything that could then have an impact on the food safety and then make whatever decision you have to control or inform that there's a problem. So under that law, therefore, may contain is still a legal requirement because there's an obligation also to produce safe food and supply safe food to the point of consumption.
If I can add to that, so this is about clearly explain about the presence of allergen, intentional and unintentional presence of allergen. However, there's also an additional piece of regulation specific for gluten, and this is about the absence of gluten. So you got the presence of the allergens and the absence of gluten in this regulation. So if you claim, if your product, your meal, your food is gluten-free, there is a specific threshold that needs to be respected. That means that your food has been prepared to avoid at the maximum the cross-contamination, and you produce a food that is below no more than 20 parts per million. That means no more than 20 milligram per kilo of gluten in that product. So it's a guarantee. And that's the only wording that can be used, and this is what this piece of legislation says, that when you refer to that, it's gluten-free, and there has been a process in place to produce it.
Great. Thank you. What do you say the role of audits and safety inspections play in maintaining that food safety environment?
Really important. We go out and do audits. So we've been working with a local hospital down south. And we've gone in and done an audit, and we've picked up on all sorts of areas. To be fair, the key areas are, we talked to her earlier, that when the food leaves the kitchen, it goes onto the ward, and the controls are not always there in place. So we feel that the inspections and audits need to be carried out both in the kitchen, but at ward level as well, to look at storage, how food is stored from both a food safety angle and an allergen angle, how things are labelled, you know, making toast on the ward. I've had experience where I've been in hospital and I'm obviously gluten-free, and they said, oh, we'll get you some toast or whatever. I'm like, have you got a separate toaster? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So having that documented process of how to do gluten-free toast on the ward, they had gluten-free toaster bags, and then he came back and said, oh, we're not allowed to use them because it's a safety hazard, it might catch on fire. I'm like, okay, so you need to make sure that whatever the processes you've got, it's documented, and that there's consistency across the whole hospital about how food is stored, how, you know, the information, how to take the order from the customer. It's all part of an allergy policy that you should be doing with how-to information, and that is where the information needs to be.
No, I mean, if you think of an audit, it's essentially testing that what you've said you will do is actually happening. And I think sometimes we can get very hung up in this and actually find, oh, it's allergens, it's scary, I'm not quite sure what I should be doing. But the principle is really straightforward. There's clean or there's dirty. There's awareness and there's no awareness. So actually, if you're cleaning down effectively, then you should be getting rid of allergens as much as you will do for bacteria and pathogens in particular, or just any food ingredient that you don't want to be present. So rather than being, oh, this is really scary, it's about allergens, it's actually about very good cleaning. In a similar way, if you need to identify whether you're putting peas or sweet corn or potatoes into a meal, you know that because your container will be labelled. So it's making sure that you've got the labelling right and you're including allergens. So it's not necessarily doing something very different, it's just doing things better, taking into account that allergens may be present, rather than thinking of it as something I only do when I'm handling allergens.
I think one of the key things that we find is understanding that sanitizer doesn't kill allergens. So people think, oh, even in restaurants and hotels, so you see them go around and they say, well, I've cleaned it with a sanitizer. Two-stage cleaning is very important for allergens to avoid cross-contamination. Hot soapy water, removal, disposable cloths, remove it, and then you do your sanitizer as per manufacturing instructions. But we do find that when we question people and say, what's two-stage cleaning? Sometimes we have a bit of a query on it. So I think that's quite a key area.
So would you say the landscape's changed recently with all new regulations, the audits, the safety inspections, you know, for allergens? Is it changed for the good? Is it to help?
I mean, I think coming back to something we were saying earlier, you know, there's still a lack of science in a lot of these areas. So I think to sit and say, yes, absolutely, there's been progress and things have got better is accurate, but we shouldn't consider that to be where we need to be from that level. So, you know, for example, with Natasha's Law, which we were talking about earlier, there was a survey done with people living with a food hypersensitivity, and 40% of those that responded said, yes, this has made a really positive improvement. But if you think that's 40%, there's still the other 60%, so there's work still to be done. There's discussion around thresholds, so how much allergen does it take to actually cause me to have a symptom? We still don't really understand that fully, and that helps to inform in things like precautionary allergen labelling, what level of testing needs to be done. So I think both from a regulation point of view, and I think we'll talk guidance later, and you both certainly provide guidance and training. There is moves forward to actually support people. There's more information available. It's easy to understand, but we still shouldn't forget there's a long way to go. So I think rather than just relying on legislation or just relying on guidance, it's, as I say, back to that risk assessment, really understand, how am I running my kitchen? How am I running my service, whether that's staff or patient? And then just saying, okay, how do I take that risk out? And does that align with guidance and legislation? But that's the baseline. There's always things we can do more and better.
Yeah, and you mentioned support. Is the government support to help with these, with hospitals?
The FSA obviously are very busy people. They've got so much going on that they certain things arise, and then they do consultations, and then they've got to go through a process. There's always a slow process. Obviously, with the guidance that came out earlier this year, that took a little while going, and there was some consultation. The PAL thing, it's been going on for a number of years. It's going to be a bit of a slow process, and I understand that because, you know, there's so many different implications with precautionary allergen labelling. Sometimes reactions happen when people do sport, or they have alcohol. So again, it's how do you work out what is that level for people to be able to consume. So there's that side of it as well. I think the FSA need to do a little bit more about validation, maybe certification, and going down that way. I think with the audits that environmental health officers do, allergens do not always take up a big piece of it, and they don't know what to look for. And that was, you know, the training we've just done recently. It was quite clear that they were looking at areas, what can we identify, spot check really easily, and we were able to give that information to them. But again, it's not always possible because obviously the training and the budgets and short staff and the timing. So there is still work to be done within the government and local authorities. And I think they realise that, but it's funding.
Yeah, it is funding, but I mean, the landscape has changed. You said it's become more visible, more regulated, and more scrutinized. Absolutely. And the government, the FS, the Food Standard Agency, is providing guidance, a lot of guidance, maybe too much guidance at some point. And that's where you really need to start deciding, should this be regulated? I'm thinking in particular about the training. The training should be mandatory. If you want to work in any environment, catering, that be it in hospital, be it in the out of home, in the hospitality, you work, be it that you're delivering the meal with a trolley, or you're working in the kitchen, you should be trained and understand allergen and the risk of cross-contamination or gluten, of course. So I think training for me, it remains a priority. And as much as you provide guidance, at some point, probably some kind of stricter legislation probably will have to...
Yeah, I agree at ward level. I think the thing is with doctors, nurses, they do training, but they don't really learn about allergens. Even on a sort of the top level, rather even, you know, deep dive. So when they do training, I believe they should have like an hour seminar to understand it. I mean, I've gone in to have a inpatient thing done. They give you a biscuit after you've had the process. I'm like, I can't eat that. Oh, that little bit will be okay. You're like, no, it won't. And then also recently, last year I had to go for a procedure, and obviously I had one of the wristbands put on, and obviously I'm gluten-free and milk-free, but when I was a bit stressed at the time, but when I got home and I read it, it said lactose-free, and I'm like, okay, that's not good. So I went back and I was able to feed in through to them and say, lactose isn't the same as milk. Obviously, if that was somebody that had a milk allergy, it would have been a real issue. So being able to understand those differences within medical teams is obviously going to help going forward as well. So I think, yeah, just avoiding those confusions that are out there, basic training needed for those people on a ward level.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I guess at root cause level, there's actually the point of funding as well. So hopefully, you know, Alex, you'll talk a bit later about working in relation to gluten and gluten-containing cereals. But back to the aspect, as we said, there's still a lot we don't understand and need to be able to move forward. And I think the government really needs to be making a pot of money available, both for the education piece, but actually for the scientific understanding as well. Because this is a hard thing to deal with at the moment, because we haven't got thresholds. It's not like bacteria where we can say, well, you can't have more than this number of bacteria within a gram of food. We really don't know what those levels are. And I think we are moving too slowly and setting some initial standards for people to work to, which should simplify it, whether you're a manufacturer, a grower, or a caterer, to somebody, to really know what it is I have to work to. Because working to zero is not the best target, even though we should always be aiming for zero. If you talk to anybody in food, they're going to say, actually, that's just not possible to hit zero every time. And if you remove choice, because people are saying there's a may contain here, then actually you're forcing somebody with a food hypersensitivity to take a risk, because we have to eat. We cannot avoid food. So there's a real balance to be taken in understanding these things. And my call to government would be, fund it, please.
Yeah, so I suppose implementing that effective allergen and gluten-free policies within healthcare specifically, what kind of allergen and gluten-free policies should be implemented in food preparation and service areas and in your...
I think within food service, within hospitals, there's lots of different services. So you've got fresh cooked, you've got the CP units, which is fresh CPU, we've got frozen CPU, we've got bought-in foods, and then, yeah, there's a whole range of areas. So standardising across the whole NHS is really difficult. We worked on the food review with Phil Shelley, and we've sort of put some cases forward for training and understanding that type of thing as well, and policies. But basically, they need to identify some standardised processes, capture the patient allergen information. How do we do that at admission? Because sometimes I tell a nurse I've got gluten intolerance, doesn't get anywhere to the catering department until way later. They've got to come and ask another question, and it could be lost in translation. So figuring out how you can do that as well. Consistent labelling on food. So obviously food sometimes gets delivered to the ward and the patient's left, so the next patient gets that meal, and that patient might be celiac, and it might be that they can't have it as well. Also putting in place a process. We talked earlier that we've developed a ward booklet which gives more information. It tells the patient or the ward staff how that patient can have a meal if they've gone for testing and they've come back, how they can get a pre-packed lunch, how they can go and get a meal from the canteen if they need one, and there's forms and things like that as well. So having a process in place which is quite good. Communication, so handovers, talking to dietitians, because sometimes the dietitian doesn't always get involved as much as they should do, and then the catering manager. So if you've got an allergen outside the top 14 and you go into hospital, you need to be fed. You can't not be fed. So again, if you've got a cook-freeze situation, then your pre-packed meals that you guys provide are going to be the ideal option, as long as they go along with it. All the ingredients are there, all that information. But it might be onions. I mean, onions is in everything, isn't it? We have a problem with those type of things. Storage, obviously segregated storage and those sort of areas, and equipment. To be fair, we're not really fans of purple equipment because there's 14 allergens, and we say we tend to stick for purple for gluten-free, to be honest. We don't say it's all allergens. So again, it's having that areas in there. So lots of different areas, but spelling it out in your allergy policy and your food safety management system is key.
Yeah. And I think adding to that is coming back, something I said earlier, it's about general good practice. So if you say, okay, I've got to segregate my allergens, I'll put all my allergens on that shelf and all my non-allergens over here. But if I'm allergic to fish, frankly, I don't care what you do with your nuts or your egg or your mollusk. I don't want any fish in my food, so don't store my nuts next to fish. So then do you have 14 shelves for all the 14 allergens? You might say, okay, I can manage that. What about when you take the combinations of the 14? You're talking thousands of shelves to actually have every combination possible. Whereas if you put a policy in place that says, in general, this is a standard of cleaning. In general, this is a standard of separation. Keep things in a closed container. Make sure the container is clearly labelled. If you're filling the container with an allergen, don't do it next to something else so you don't get any spillage issues or dust issues. So it's thinking about what's the general practice that I can put in place to control everything. That way, when your employer, you go into work, it doesn't matter what it is you're handling, because you handle everything to the best practice, to the best level of care, and you prevent all contamination. And that point Carolyn made earlier is really important. Yes, there are 14 listed allergens, but people are allergic to potentially any ingredient, so you don't want any cross-contact, regardless of whether it's a 14 allergen or it's not.
So Ian, how can the role of a pre-prepared meal solution help manage some of the potential allergen risks, reduce the risk of gluten-free cross-contamination within hospitals?
But I think I would start from the catering end of things rather than the manufacturing end. Again, this is about the exclusion of an ingredient that somebody's unable to eat without getting ill. So by buying in something pre-packed that says, look, I can tell you this food does not contain, then you know you're not getting the cross-contact because it's in a fully sealed container. Ideally, you're cooking it in that fully sealed container, and you can present that fully sealed container to the person who's going to consume it. So they can also have the confidence in seeing the label, seeing that it's sealed, knowing there's no cross-contact. But also in doing that, you're assuming that your manufacturer has done a good job. So there's a selection about the manufacturer, your supplier as well. Now, one of the things that we do as a business is, because it is pre-packed, because it's frozen, is we actually test for any allergen that we will handle, and therefore there's a risk of cross-contact, to make sure that we cannot detect it before that single batch of food is actually released for sale. So it's about as guaranteed free-from as you can potentially get. But then, as I say, gives that confidence that when you're handling lots of different ingredients and foodstuffs in a busy catering kitchen, that actually I know that meal is safe. So there's a real benefit to doing that, as I say, and having it from an accredited source, such as ourselves.
Yeah. So when we go into hospitals, we have our training operations team, and they have the basic safety knowledge and allergen knowledge. So they go in and do some training. Caroline, how important would you say the role of staff training and awareness for the risks and safety practices around the management?
Absolutely key. Absolutely key. To be fair, when we go into hospitals, they're normally doing a level 2 or a level 3 training, depending on what they're doing within the actual kitchen area. But when it, as we've said, the issue can be when the food leaves the kitchen and goes onto the ward staff, some of the allergen training is voluntary. We say as a bare minimum, the FSA online training, but we'd like to see a lot more information, or a lot more in-depth training for that level staff, and even some of the nurses on the ward, etc., that are also helping to feed people as well. So it's quite key that they're all getting the right information. I think some of the volunteers as well. So obviously you've got a lot of volunteers in the hospital. Sometimes they're helping to serve the food. Sometimes they're helping to help feed, because there's obviously assisted and protected meal times. And again, they need more in-depth training really to give them better knowledge, so they're asking the right questions and communicating, because I think a lot of the issues that we find is all about miscommunication.
I think I would agree with that. Absolutely. It's key, because then they also have to understand why allergen and cross-contamination control matters, and how to apply it consistently on a daily basis. Absolutely, we agree. When they leave the kitchen, even the person that delivers the meal and is on the trolley, they have to be stored, the foods, in a certain way. You have to double check that you're delivering the right meal. And if I want to double check that mine is a gluten-free or an allergen-free meal, the person that is giving me my meal should be able to understand what it is that I'm asking and what it is that I'm double checking with them. Not only the training, but sometimes we have to consider that training has to be specific to the job that the person is doing. So you've got a specific training for the people that are working in the kitchen, but can be very different from the training as someone that delivers the meal, for example, or is working in other areas. So all this, the training is a priority, absolutely essential. Yes.
I think, including in that, it's so important that people recognise and understand the labelling requirements as well. We've spoken about that from a guidance, from legislation, from good practice and policy. But there has to be this understanding that free from means free from. If a food does not say free from an allergen, we should never assume that it is. May contain is clear, it may have a presence. Ingredient lists should have in bold or capitals to say these are the allergens that are present. But there's an awful lot of food that is neither free from nor may contain, and just because it doesn't have a may contain, it should not be considered free from. The other area people can often make an error is they assume that vegan equals allergen free, because it shouldn't contain any egg, or there should be no milk. But actually, if it doesn't say it's free from egg and milk, there still may be a risk that there's been a cross-contact somewhere. And back to the definitions Alex explained earlier, if that's a lifestyle choice, it does not equate to a food safety choice. There's not necessarily the same level of control in place. So understanding the terms that are used is really important in ensuring patient safety. The other factor I would bring in is, the training can be really, really good. But if they haven't taken into account the people being trained, it may fail. And I'm thinking here around, for example, if English is a second language, there may not be an understanding. Somebody may not just have a good command of English for whatever reason. So how do you get that training across so people appreciate what they're being told and can put it into practice, which is ultimately the point?
Yeah, and I suppose the landscape's changing quite a bit with the various different regulations and things coming in. Is there a regulation on how often they should be trained within hospitals?
Not at the moment. I think with the food safety, obviously it's commensurate with their role, and same with allergens, it's commensurate. If they obviously work with food, they should have a level 2 or level 3 or level 4 food safety, depending on what their role is and where they are in the management structure. But even with allergen training at the moment, there's not even, you should renew it every 2 years or 3 years. So we need to sort of probably bring that in there as well. And I think, as I spoke earlier about the ward booklet that we've introduced, it's a training tool that people can read and sign off against. And it's got all the information there about the allergen process, how to make toast safely, what the cleaning protocols are for 2-stage cleaning, how to take fridge temperatures. Okay, that's not allergen related, but again, these people, you can't really take a probe with these people that are on a ward and explain to them how that works. And then there's obviously the probe cleaning and all that type of thing. So trying to put a process in place and make sure that they're following those processes is probably the next best thing to this training, really, and trying to, give them a better awareness of food safety and what their responsibilities are and what happens when it goes wrong. So again, giving you a link to some of the videos that are out there to see how it is as well. But it is quite difficult. And going back to what you were saying about the vegan, so the Vegan Society accreditation, again, something is vegan accreditation does not mean there's no risk of cross-contamination. We've had conversations with them about having 2 stages, one that's an A+, maybe, so that it does have, no cross-contamination, or just the standard, but at the moment they're not going down that route. So I think, just because it's vegan accredited, don't think it isn't got any make contains on it, because it does, or can.
With the people who are serving the food, they need to understand, they need to have certain training, they need to have, be able to look at the training and understand the allergens so they can pass it on. What role would you say patients themselves or carers or parents have in that to allow them to have the correct food?
No, the initial responsibility lies with the hospital or where they are now. However, some patients are not able to advocate for themselves, for example, in their hospital. So there must be a robust process of communication. The family can help, must say it's from the very start, from the moment they arrive at the hospital, from the moment they're delivered the meal, there must be a system in place where the staff can double check what meal the person needs. It's essential that this goes. The family must be. You can't rely always 100% on a family double checking. If someone is not there at the time of a meal is being delivered, there must be a system in place, and there must be this willingness, this now automatism almost to double check what diet does the patient need, not just deliver it like that. There must be something relatively easy that can be done where there's a double, triple check process almost in place.
I think that within hospitals, they do have, some hospitals have a process where you have a different colour tray. So again, so not always the case, but you have a red tray for allergens. You have a green tray for assisted meal eating and stuff like that. So those sort of processes are there. But I think, we need to advocate to people. I'm speaking at a healthcare conference in a couple of weeks for infant allergy. And I talk about having the confidence to speak up, having the confidence to say, I have an allergy, how are you going to do this? Having the confidence to say, we need to have that conversation about what I can and can't eat. And if they can't provide for you, then there needs to be a way of trying to bring food in, or somehow just providing that food. But again, there's always that risk of someone bringing food in. They don't want people to bring food into hospital. But sometimes if it's outside the 14 allergens and you haven't got a meal, you've got to eat something, and you can't eat baked potato for 2 weeks. Although sometimes I've heard that. But so it's important that we try and engage with those people. And I think also trying to engage with them before they come into hospital. So if they know they're going to have a long-term procedure, hospitals should have a page where it talks about allergies, what the allergy policy, how they request food, how they get in contact with the catering manager. And if they know they're going to be there for 2 weeks or a week or whatever, and it's 40 outside the 14 allergens, then they can prepare it, they can pre-plan it. And again, let's talk about communication, because it's a two-way thing, and we just need to make sure we encourage that as well.
Yeah. And I think that is a very key point. I think the communication piece ultimately is the first step, because as the patient or as the carer or as the caterer or the nurse or whoever is serving up, if you're not aware that somebody's got an allergy, and if you don't understand how sensitive that person is, then you're going to struggle potentially to actually feed them safely. Now, certainly, for myself, I'm a bad patient. I'm grumpy when I'm not well. And despite, hospitals and catering teams trying to do the best they can each mealtime to say to a patient, have you got a food allergy? Have you got a hypersensitivity of some sort? They can get quite grumpy sometimes. I filled that out in the last meal. Why do I have to do it in every meal? So I think needs to be a willingness almost from the patient to understand that it's ultimately for their benefit and for their safety and being asked to do these things. But there may be also something to be done around the system side. So somebody has already filled out where they are allergic or hypersensitive. They can tick a box to say, I've already completed this. And then somebody can go and check that and see where it is. And that could help with moving wards as well. But I think we have to appreciate that ultimately hospitals may have patients changing bed in between meal serves. So you made the point earlier about the fact you might have ordered a meal and then you're not there and the next patient gets it. So, it's being aware of what's being achieved or trying to be achieved. And I think we're talking a lot about patients, but we also should not forget staff service and visitor service as well. The same processes and procedures really have to be there too. We've spoken about Natasha's law, information for consumers and the other regulations that sit there, that has to be applied to service counters as well. So we should never forget it's not just about patients, it's everybody is eating in that facility.
Yeah. Obviously, we mentioned training before. You mentioned, Caroline, award booklet that you've done for a hospital down south. Do either of you recommend any resources for hospital catering staff? Is there anything we could share and put some links up onto the webinar after?
Yeah, so the Food Standards Agency obviously have a very bare minimum induction training. That is, it's free. Why would you not do it? So yeah, definitely. They also have a root cause analysis training. We talk about near miss reporting. So when things go wrong, you should be logging it, etc. Again, I'd recommend managers to do the root cause analysis training. Again, it's free. So that's there as well. Allergy UK, Anaphylaxis UK as well. They have resources on there for people who work with children, and they have fact sheets and that type of thing. On our website, we have fact sheets that we help with. We give free that helps people with different allergies, like allergy oral syndrome, all about eggs or milk, etc. How to feed people at Christmas, sometimes top tips. I've been working with the food safety expert, Natalie Stanton. We've produced a video training for level 2 and level 3, which has just been launched. Again, you can either go and buy it individually on the website, or you can buy it in bulk and put it on your LOS system on the school. So yeah, lots of training that's out there, and obviously
specific. We've got some specific on CAKK as well. So we have a booklet, Catering gluten-free, how to get it right. You have all the information in there, really, to how to avoid cross-contamination throughout the manufacturing, the processing of you make your meal. We have our GFA accreditation scheme, with the gluten-free accreditation scheme for the hospitality, for the hospitals as well. If they want to have an accreditation, to make sure that all the process throughout, from the ingredient up to the meal delivery, is following a process to avoid cross-contamination with gluten. And also, of course, we also have specific training on gluten-free catering.
And I think, just generalise that, I'm sure you could plug yourselves even more. And I would genuinely recommend that people do go in and have a look at both of your websites. And you mentioned some of the other charities as well. And I think sometimes a misconception that if you go to Coeliac UK, it's only about somebody getting information if they've got celiac, or if they're gluten intolerant. Or if you go to Allergy UK, it's only for people who have a food allergy, but actually it's not. There's a lot of training there for caterers and food workers as well. And so even if you're simply catering for somebody that's suffering in that way or living with an allergy, then actually the website still have a lot of information that you can apply to help safeguard that person. So I definitely recommend, if somebody hasn't, to have a look at the websites here, but also of any of those charities. There's a whole raft of training that's available for free.
Absolutely. One of the things we're doing at the moment is we're doing some research on accreditation schemes and certification schemes. So we're running a pilot, and we're looking for hospitals, businesses that want to take part in that and be involved. but setting standards, because I think we need to push it back up towards the Food Standard Agency to have some standards which are based within the 5-star hygiene rating, to make sure we're doing it in there as well. But we're doing the research with the local university. We've got some students that are going to do some research. So for the value of it, for the food hypersensitive customer, what they value it, for the businesses, whether they're, as a hospital, whether it's a value to them and it's going to show people that, they're doing a good job, or any other business or hotel, will you go there to eat because it's got a higher rating? And then also for the environmental health officers, because having an approval scheme in place or a certification scheme in place makes their life easier when they go and do an audit. You should have that this documentation in place, this policy, this process. If you've got that, all it has to do is come out the cupboard, or hopefully it's on the shelf and it's people who are going to read it quite a lot. But again, it's there as well. So if any hospitals are interested in helping and taking part in that, then please do get in contact.
Yeah, and I think similar, we all sit in various committees, and Alex and I, sit with the FSA on an allergy team, and you're engaged as well in lots of areas. And quite often consultation comes out and plans to improve things. There's actually very little response. So I would also put a call out to anybody who's catering to actually take the time to look at those consultations, to feed in the thoughts and comments, because not only does that then give direction to the work that's taking place, but it potentially makes the work of every caterer easier if their needs are being met. So I think it's engaging as well, however you can, to actually improve things.
You're absolutely right. And Caroline was referring to the recent FSA guidance out in for the non-prepacked foods, and that is going to be reviewed quite soon, I have to say. So if it's being used, absolutely, that's our appeal as well, to make notes of how that can be improved at the next review of this guidance, because it's fresh, it's new, and there are aspects that probably could be reviewed.
Make it regulatory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think, if I had, as I say, a closing comment to something I said before, I think people can see allergens as something that's scary, which in itself isn't a bad thing, because it then drives us to do better. But it's just about good practice. If you understand what the risks are, and if you understand how they can be controlled, it's not something to do differently. It's just doing what you do today better, having taken allergens into account.
And just taking a step backwards, it's not rocket science. Think about how you prepare things, what order you prepare things, how you prepare them, and also about what you have on your menu. If you don't need an allergen in there, it doesn't compromise the taste, it doesn't compromise the quality, remove it. You don't need it in there, you don't need it in there. You just see some products that's got milk in it. You're like, why have you got milk in that product? It's, when I went to college, you didn't make it with milk, so why are you putting milk in it or butter in it now? So yeah, definitely.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your time today. I hope you found that informative. Any references to any links will be shown at the bottom of the page. Thank you very much.